"We have a breach, and all evidence points to the intern," the security chief said, and in that instant the entire executive floor seemed to stop breathing, as if the air itself had been switched off. Maya Carter stood just outside the glass conference room, holding a folder she had not even opened yet. Her name still displayed on the ID badge clipped to her blazer, Intern, IT Department, Level 1 Access. She read it herself for a brief moment, as if confirming she was still real in a room that was already deciding she was not. Inside, the long polished table reflected the cold white ceiling lights, and at the head of it sat Richard Holloway, the CEO of Virion Systems, a man known for turning failing companies into global giants and for making decisions faster than most people could finish a sentence. His gaze did not move when Maya entered. It stayed fixed on the security monitor in front of him, where lines of data scrolled like a verdict being written in real time. The files were transferred using her credentials, someone added, not loudly, but firmly enough that it became truth before anyone questioned it. Maya stepped forward anyway, because silence felt heavier than accusation, and said quietly, "That's not possible." But no one responded to her voice the way a room responds to a person. Instead, they responded to her presence like a problem that had already been categorized. Daniel Cross, Senior Operations Manager, leaned back slightly with a measured expression that did not need words to communicate doubt. Samantha Reed from HR avoided eye contact entirely, scrolling through a tablet as if policy could replace judgment. And somewhere behind them, the IT department lead, Ethan Blake, frowned at the screen just a fraction longer than anyone else. But he said nothing yet. Richard finally spoke without looking at her, his voice calm in a way that made it more final. "We are not debating intent. We are confirming access." And with that single line, the room shifted from inquiry to conclusion. Maya felt her pulse steady instead of spike, not because she was calm, but because she had learned in the last 3 weeks of her internship that panic never convinced anyone who had already chosen certainty. "I was in the archive lab from 2:10 to 3 p.m., she said. "My workstation logs will prove it." Daniel exhaled like the answer was predictable. "Logs can be altered," he replied, and that was when Ethan looked up again. Just briefly, just long enough for a thought to form behind his eyes before it disappeared behind protocol. The CEO finally turned his head toward Maya, studying her not as guilty or innocent, but as something temporary standing in the way of resolution. "If you didn't do it," he said evenly, "then someone used you." And those words, though not an accusation, landed like one, because in that room being used still meant being responsible. Maya opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Ethan's monitor flickered once, almost imperceptibly, a single line of system activity appearing where it should not have been, then vanishing again as if it had never existed, and in that fraction of a second, unnoticed by everyone except him, the first crack in the story they were building had already begun to form. The silence inside the executive floor did not break after the accusation. It only changed shape, becoming more structured, more procedural, as if the room had decided that emotion was no longer part of the decision-making process. Maya Carter remained standing near the glass wall, where reflections of shifting data screens flickered across her face. She noticed how no one was looking at her directly anymore. They were looking through her, as if her presence had already been converted into a case file. Ethan Blake finally turned his chair slightly away from the main display and pulled up a secondary system log. His fingers moved slowly, not because he was uncertain, but because he was careful, and caution in a room like this always meant something important was being hidden or discovered. Samantha Reed quietly marked notes on her tablet, her expression controlled, neutral, but her pauses between entries were getting longer. Daniel Cross remained relaxed in posture, yet his eyes tracked every movement of Ethan's screen with a precision that suggested anticipation rather than concern. Richard Holloway stood without moving from the head of the table, arms loosely folded, his attention fixed on the timeline projection of file transfers that had been reconstructed from internal monitoring systems. "The activity matches her login window exactly," Daniel said after a moment, his tone suggesting finality rather than observation. Maya immediately responded, "Login windows can overlap if credentials are duplicated or mirrored." Her voice was steady but not raised, yet it felt like it collided softly against the glass walls and returned without impact. Ethan paused at that statement, his eyes narrowing slightly as he expanded the authentication layer of the logs. He whispered more to himself than to the room. Mirrored credentials would require a session token replication or internal privilege escalation. And for the first time, the word escalation changed the energy in the room, not because it proved anything, but because it suggested complexity where simplicity had already been assumed. Richard finally turned fully toward Ethan. "Is that possible in our system?" he asked, and Ethan hesitated just long enough for hesitation itself to become noticeable. "It is not standard, but it is not impossible," he answered. And that single clarification caused Samantha Reed to look up from her tablet for the first time. Maya took a small step forward, sensing that the conversation was shifting away from accusation and toward architecture, the structure of the system itself. "If someone had elevated access," she said carefully, "they would not need my credentials at all." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but he responded quickly, "Unless they wanted to frame someone." The word frame settled in the air without resistance, and that was when Ethan's screen flashed again, this time longer. A background process had surfaced, hidden within routine diagnostic traffic, labeled under a generic maintenance protocol, but its origin point was not aligned with any intern workstation. It originated from an administrative node. Ethan's expression changed for the first time, not dramatically, but enough that Richard noticed. "What is it?" the CEO asked. Ethan did not answer immediately, because what he was seeing contradicted the assumption that had already been accepted as truth. Instead, he rotated the monitor slightly, so only he could see the full trace path. Then he said, quietly, "This did not originate from her device." And the room, which had been structured around certainty moments before, began to lose its stability in small, invisible increments, like a foundation discovering that one of its pillars had been placed in the wrong location. Maya did not relax, but her breathing shifted slightly, because for the first time since she entered the room, the system itself was no longer silent against her. The moment Ethan Blake confirmed that the data did not originate from Maya Carter's device, the entire executive floor shifted into a different kind of silence, not the silence of certainty, but the silence of systems recalculating themselves. Richard Holloway stepped closer to the central display, his eyes narrowing as he studied the authentication trail, now expanding across multiple layers of the company network, each node lighting up like a map revealing movement that should not have existed. Daniel Cross leaned forward slightly, his voice still controlled but with a sharper edge than before. "That is not possible without elevated clearance," he said, but Ethan did not respond immediately, because his attention was now fully locked on a sequence of administrative access calls that repeated at precise intervals, too precise to be accidental. Samantha Reed finally lowered her tablet, her posture shifting from administrative detachment to concern. "If this did not come from her workstation," she said slowly, "then someone used internal infrastructure to route it through." Her credentials. Maya, still standing near the glass wall, felt the room change again, not in her favor, not against her, but away from simple conclusions. Ethan enlarged the data stream and isolated a hidden process running under system maintenance permissions. The label appeared generic, but the signature beneath it was not. It belonged to a senior-level access profile, and when Ethan traced it backward, the origin resolved into a departmental node linked to operations management. Daniel Cross adjusted his cuff slightly, a subtle movement that no one acknowledged but Maya noticed because silence makes small details louder. Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower now. "There is a secondary authentication chain embedded in the transfer protocol." He paused, then continued. "It is designed to overwrite origin logs after execution." The phrase overwrite origin logs caused Richard Holloway's expression to harden, not with anger, but with calculation, as if he had just realized the problem was not about one employee, but about the integrity of the entire system they trusted. Maya took a careful step forward again, her voice steady, but now carrying controlled urgency. "That means whoever did this wanted it to look clean from the beginning." Daniel immediately replied, "Or someone is trying to manipulate interpretation of the logs." But this time his confidence had a slight fracture in it. Ethan ignored the exchange and pulled up access metadata from the last 24 hours, filtering only privileged sessions. The screen refreshed, and for a brief Moment nothing appeared unusual. Then a single administrative login sequence expanded across the display, showing a chain of approvals that included override permissions typically reserved for senior management escalation. Ethan's eyes stopped moving for a second, and that second felt heavier than everything that had happened before it. This access chain includes operational approval signatures, he said quietly. Richard turned his head sharply. Whose signatures? Ethan hesitated again then. Enlarged the final node of the chain, and the room went still in a different way. Because the system was no longer pointing outward toward the intern, it was pointing inward toward authority. Maya watched Ethan carefully, and for the first time since she entered the room, she did not feel like the subject of an accusation. She felt like the beginning of a correction, and as Ethan prepared to trace the final layer of the hidden route, every person in the room understood without speaking at that. The truth they were about to see would not only change the case, but also the people who had already decided it was closed. The executive floor remained locked in a state of suspended logic as Ethan Blake continued tracing the hidden authentication chain. His eyes fixed on the screen where layers of administrative access were now unfolding like a map that had been intentionally buried beneath routine system activity. Richard Holloway stood motionless at the head of the conference table, his arms no longer folded, his posture now fully engaged, as if physical stillness could help him process digital movement faster. Maya Carter stayed near the glass wall, but had shifted slightly forward, no longer positioned like someone awaiting judgment, but like someone observing the judgment itself being reconstructed. Samantha Reed had stopped taking notes entirely, her tablet resting and used in her hands. Daniel Cross, however, maintained his composure. But there was a subtle tension in the way his gaze no longer stayed on Ethan's screen for long stretches of time. Ethan expanded the access chain further, and the system responded with a delayed reveal of deeper privilege escalation logs, each layer confirming that the breach path did not originate from any standard user endpoint. Instead, it flowed through a controlled internal authorization route that required multiple high-level approvals. Ethan spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word needed to be verified before being released. This access sequence was not direct. It was routed through internal administrative authorization nodes. He paused briefly, then added, which means it had to be approved or masked by someone within the operations hierarchy. The room absorbed that statement without interruption, because interruption now felt like denial rather than dialogue. Richard turned slightly toward Daniel, not accusing, but observing, and said, "Operations hierarchy includes your department." Daniel responded immediately, too quickly to appear entirely natural. "It includes multiple departments, not just mine." But his tone carried a defensive weight that had not been present earlier. Maya watched the exchange carefully, her attention no longer on her own defense, but on the structure of truth forming in real time. Ethan then isolated a secondary signature embedded in the access logs, a digital fingerprint that repeated across multiple administrative actions over the past 48 hours, and when he cross-referenced it with user roles, the system flagged a senior operations credential tied to workflow approval privileges. Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking, and that hesitation changed the emotional temperature of the room. "This signature belongs to a senior management access profile," he said, and the phrase senior management caused Richard Holloway to straighten fully. Samantha finally lifted her head, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief. Daniel Cross exhaled slowly, but did not speak. Ethan continued the trace, pulling up the approval sequence timeline, where each step of the intrusion had been silently validated by internal permissions that should have prevented such activity rather than enabling it. "The system is showing layered authorization approval," Ethan explained, "which means someone with elevated privileges either initiated or concealed the activity using legitimate access pathways." Maya's voice broke the silence, calm but precise. "So the system itself was used against its own security structure." Ethan nodded once. "Yes, that is accurate." Richard moved closer to the display, his focus narrowing on the final node of the access chain, which was now highlighted in amber, indicating primary responsibility for the override sequence. Samantha whispered without realizing she was speaking aloud, "That should not be possible without direct executive clearance." And that sentence lingered because it introduced a possibility no one in the room wanted to fully Articulate. Ethan prepared to expand the final node, but paused, glancing briefly at Richard, as if confirming permission to proceed. Richard gave a slight nod, and the system immediately revealed the last layer of the chain, where the administrative approval signature resolved into a name that sat at the intersection of authority and operations control. And in that moment, the narrative of certainty that had defined the room began to dissolve into something far more unstable, because the breach was no longer pointing outward at a single intern, but inward toward the structure that had already decided she was guilty. The final authorization node expanded across the screen like a sealed document finally forced open, and for a brief moment the executive floor did not react at all, as if the system itself had paused to allow human perception to catch up with what it was showing. Ethan Blake kept his cursor steady over the highlighted signature field, his breathing controlled but noticeably slower as the metadata resolved into a fully verified administrative identity. Richard Holloway stepped closer to the display, his eyes narrowing not in anger but in the kind of focus that comes when a conclusion is no longer simple enough to be comfortable. Samantha Reed had gone completely still, her tablet now lowered to her side. Forgotten. Daniel Cross shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that suggested recalibration rather than confidence. Maya Carter remained near the glass wall, but her attention was now fully on the screen, because for the first time since entering the room, the system was not speaking about her at all. Ethan finally spoke, and his voice carried a quiet precision that made every word feel irreversible. The final authorization signature belongs to an internal operations clearance profile tied to senior management override privileges. He paused briefly as the system confirmed the match across redundant security layers, then continued. It shows approval routing through multiple administrative checkpoints before execution. Richard did not look away from the screen when he asked, which checkpoint initiated the first approval? Ethan scrolled back through the sequence, isolating the earliest valid entry point, and the room seemed to contract slightly as the timeline narrowed, because the origin was not an external breach, nor an intern-level credential, but an internal authorization gate embedded deep within operations control structure. Daniel Cross spoke before Ethan could finish the trace, his tone carefully measured. Internal routing does not confirm responsibility. But even as he said it, the screen refreshed again, revealing a repeated access pattern linked to the same authorization identity across multiple system functions. Ethan's expression tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of what the pattern implied. This is not a single event, he said quietly. It is a recurring access behavior over multiple sessions. Samantha finally reacted, her voice low, almost disbelieving. Over multiple sessions. Ethan nodded once, then expanded the historical log window, showing timestamps that extended back further than the initial incident window, each one validated through legitimate system protocols. Maya stepped forward slightly, her voice steady but no longer defensive. That means the system was already being used before today's incident. Ethan acknowledged. Yes, the structure indicates prior access under authorized conditions. Richard's jaw tightened, not with emotion, but with the weight of implication, because authorized conditions meant oversight, and oversight meant accountability at a level far above procedural error. Daniel Cross finally broke his silence again. Even if that is true, it does not explain intent. But Ethan did not respond immediately, because the system had already moved beyond intent and into execution pathways, and when he finally spoke, his words carried a different tone. Intent cannot be confirmed through logs alone, but pattern consistency shows deliberate structuring of access routes. The room fell into a deeper silence, one that was no longer about suspicion or defense, but about recalibration of understanding. Richard finally turned slightly away from the screen, looking at each person in the room in sequence, as if measuring how quickly certainty had collapsed into uncertainty, and Maya, standing in the same place she had been since the beginning, realized that the truth was no longer about proving her innocence, but about exposing how easily the system had been guided away from it. The executive floor had entered a state where silence was no longer passive. It was active, structured, and heavy with implication. As Ethan Blake continued to scroll through the extended authorization logs, each line reinforcing the same uncomfortable truth that the breach was not a single isolated action, but part of a repeated and controlled access pattern embedded deep within internal systems. Richard Holloway stood at the edge of the central display now, no longer as an unquestioned authority but as someone absorbing the full weight of structural exposure. Samantha Reed had set her tablet completely aside, her hands resting still on the table, as if she no longer trusted written procedures to explain what she was seeing. Daniel Cross remained composed in posture, but the stillness in his expression had shifted into something more cautious, as if every additional second increased the risk of interpretation turning against him. Maya Carter stayed near the glass wall, but her focus was entirely on Ethan's screen, no longer concerned with defending herself, only observing how the system itself was unfolding beyond human intention. Ethan finally expanded a deeper layer of system history, revealing archived administrative access sessions that predated the current incident window, and his voice lowered slightly as he processed what appeared across the screen. These are authenticated override sessions from previous internal security cycles, he said, pausing briefly as he cross-verified the timestamps, then continued. They originate from the same operational clearance profile. Richard turned his head slightly, his tone controlled but now carrying a sharper edge of concern. You are saying this was not the first time. Ethan nodded once. Correct. The system indicates repeated authorized usage of elevated access pathways. The phrase repeated authorized usage settled in the room like a quiet structural failure, because repetition implied knowledge, and knowledge implied responsibility somewhere within the hierarchy. Samantha finally spoke, her voice careful. If elevated access was used repeatedly, why was it not flagged by internal auditing protocols? Ethan immediately responded. It was flagged, but routed through administrative suppression layers that classify the activity as approved maintenance behavior. Daniel's gaze shifted subtly toward the screen again, but this time his attention lingered longer than before. Ethan continued to isolate the suppression logic, revealing a secondary validation system that overrode standard alerts under specific operational conditions. And as the details unfolded, Richard took a slow step back from the display, not out of retreat, but as if distance could provide perspective on something that was becoming increasingly difficult to contain within procedural explanation. Maya finally spoke again, her voice steady but quieter now. So the system did not fail, it was instructed to accept the activity. Ethan confirmed after a brief pause. Yes, the system behavior aligns with pre-authorized acceptance parameters. That statement changed the atmosphere again, because it removed the idea of accidental breach entirely, replacing it with something far more deliberate in structure. Samantha leaned forward slightly, her expression tightening. Then the question is no longer who accessed the system, she said slowly, but who defined what the system was allowed to ignore. Ethan did not answer immediately, because the data on his screen had already begun to suggest a direction that no longer pointed outward. And when Richard finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. Pull every approval record tied to that clearance profile. Ethan nodded and initiated the deeper extraction, and as the results began to load across the screen, the room collectively understood that the investigation had moved beyond identifying a breach and had entered the far more unstable territory of identifying the structure that permitted it to exist unnoticed. The deeper extraction process began to populate the central display with a continuous stream of administrative approval records, and the executive floor shifted once again into a state where silence was not absence of sound, but presence of realization forming too slowly to be spoken aloud. Ethan Blake watched the data unfold in layered sequences, each one confirming that elevated access had been granted through a structured approval pathway that bypassed standard anomaly detection thresholds by design rather than error. Richard Holloway stood completely still now, his attention locked on the cascading approval chain that extended across multiple operational cycles. Samantha Reed leaned slightly forward, her eyes tracking the timeline as it expanded beyond the current incident into archived system behavior. Daniel Cross maintained his position near the table, but his expression had become increasingly unreadable as the data continued to resolve itself into patterns that were no longer isolated events. Maya Carter remained at the glass wall, her presence quiet but steady, observing not the accusation anymore, but the architecture that had produced it. Ethan paused as a new layer loaded, and when it did, the system revealed a structured authorization map, linking multiple internal departments through a unified override protocol. He spoke carefully, as if verifying each word before allowing it into the room. This shows coordinated approval routing across operational management layers, he said, then continued after a brief pause. Each access instance is validated through internal compliance checkpoints. Richard finally turned away from the screen for a moment, his gaze moving across the room, as if recalibrating his understanding of every person present. Compliance checkpoints are supposed to prevent unauthorized activity, not enable it, he said quietly. Ethan nodded once. In standard configuration, yes, but this system has an embedded exception layer labeled as adaptive authorization. Samantha immediately responded, her tone controlled but firm. Adaptive authorization still requires accountability for activation. Ethan did not answer immediately because the next sequence appearing on the screen required confirmation before interpretation, and when it resolved, it displayed a repeated administrative override pattern tied to a single operational identity cluster that appeared across multiple time windows. Daniel Cross finally spoke again, his voice measured. You are implying a single point of control for distributed approvals. Ethan replied after a short pause. The data suggests centralized initiation with distributed validation masking. The phrase created a visible shift in the room, because distributed validation masking implied that multiple safeguards had been used not to prevent access but to legitimize it after initiation. Maya stepped slightly closer now, her voice calm but precise. So the system was not bypassed. It was guided through its own approval structure. Ethan confirmed quietly. That is consistent with the pattern. Richard moved closer to the display again, focusing on the earliest recorded instance of the authorization chain. And as he did, the system highlighted a recurring signature embedded within the initiation layer. Samantha exhaled softly as she saw the repetition across timestamps. This is not accidental replication, she said, almost to herself. Ethan expanded the identity mapping layer, revealing that the initiation signature appeared consistently at the start of each override cycle, regardless of department or time frame. Daniel adjusted his stance slightly, his tone still controlled but now lower. Even if that is accurate, it does not confirm intent to frame anyone. Ethan acknowledged the distinction, but added, it does confirm control over system routing logic. And that statement shifted the investigation from interpretation to structure, because control over routing logic meant influence over what the system considered valid. Richard finally spoke in a quiet but definitive tone. Continue tracing the initiation signature to its origin node. Ethan initiated the final trace, and as the system processed the command, every person in the room understood that they were now approaching the point where the architecture of truth itself would either hold or collapse completely. The initiation trace expanded across the screen in slow layers, each one revealing a deeper level of system governance that had remained hidden beneath normal operational visibility. And as Ethan Blake followed the chain backward, the executive floor entered a silence that felt heavier than before because it was no longer about identifying what happened, but about discovering where the authority to make it happen had originated. Richard Holloway stood at the edge of the display, with his eyes fixed on the earliest activation node now highlighted in the system. Samantha Reed remained still, her attention fully locked on the progression of timestamps that no longer pointed to a single event, but to a structured pattern of repeated authorization behavior. Daniel Cross adjusted his posture subtly, his expression controlled but increasingly tense as the trace continued to narrow. Maya Carter stayed near the glass wall, her presence quiet and steady, observing how the system that once defined her as the suspect was now revealing a structure far larger than any individual accusation. Ethan paused as the trace resolved into a primary origin cluster, and when it did, the system displayed a centralized administrative identity linked to operational governance permissions that extended across multiple departments. He spoke carefully, his voice lower than before. The initiation signature is not tied to a single user event, he said, then continued after a brief pause. It is tied to a governance-level authorization profile. Richard immediately responded, his tone firm but measured. Governance level means executive access. Ethan nodded once. Yes, it sits above departmental control layers. The room absorbed this without interruption because the implication had already begun to settle before it was spoken. Samantha finally broke the silence, her voice calm but sharp with realization. If that level initiated the access chain, then all downstream approvals were functionally procedural. Ethan confirmed quietly. That is consistent with the structure. Daniel spoke again, slower this time. Procedural approvals can still be manipulated at lower levels. But Ethan did not look away from the screen as he responded. Not when the origin node defines the validation framework itself. Maya took a small step forward, her voice steady but no longer defensive. So every system response we saw was shaped by the initial configuration. Ethan acknowledged. Yes, the system is behaving exactly as its authorization architecture instructs. Richard moved closer to the display again, studying the origin cluster as it expanded into a full administrative map, and within that map, multiple validation layers were shown converging back into a single governance node that had repeatedly triggered elevated access pathways over time. Samantha exhaled slowly. That means the investigation has been following the output instead of the source. Ethan replied after a brief pause. Correct. The output was designed to appear distributed. Daniel's gaze tightened slightly as he looked at the convergence pattern. Designed by whom? He asked, but Ethan did not answer immediately because the system had already begun highlighting a repeated structural identifier embedded within the governance layer, a pattern that indicated not just permission but active design authority over system behavior. Richard finally spoke in a quiet voice. Continue full extraction of governance logs. Ethan initiated the command, and as the deeper logs began to load, the room collectively understood that they were no longer tracing a breach, but unraveling the framework that had defined what the system was allowed to believe was true. The governance log extraction opened a deeper layer of system architecture that had never been displayed in the standard operational dashboard, and as Ethan Blake processed the incoming data stream, the executive floor became completely still in a way that suggested everyone understood they were now observing something that extended far beyond a single internal investigation. Richard Holloway stood motionless in front of the central display, his eyes fixed on the expanding governance map that now showed interconnected authorization pathways spanning across multiple executive tiers. Samantha Reed remained silent, her hands resting on the table without movement, as if she had shifted from procedural thinking into structural awareness. Daniel Cross no longer adjusted his posture. Instead, he watched the screen with a controlled stillness that carried a subtle tension beneath it. Maya Carter stayed near the glass wall, no longer the subject of scrutiny, but the only person in the room, observing the system without emotional recalibration. Ethan paused as the next layer of governance logs resolved, and when it did, the system revealed a sequence of administrative approval actions that were not tied to a single department or user identity, but instead distributed across a unified operational governance layer that synchronized decision pathways across multiple internal divisions. Ethan spoke carefully, his voice steady but lower than before. This is not standard escalation behavior, he said, then continued after a brief pause. This is centralized governance synchronization. Richard immediately responded, his tone firm but controlled. Explain synchronization. Ethan expanded the visualization, showing overlapping approval chains that merged into a single directive origin point before dispersing again into procedural execution nodes. It means the system is not responding to isolated approvals, Ethan explained. It is responding to a pre-configured governance directive that aligns multiple authorization layers into a unified execution path. Samantha finally spoke, her voice calm but increasingly precise. So every department believed they were making independent approvals. Ethan nodded once. Yes, but the system was aligning those approvals to a single directive structure. Daniel's expression tightened slightly as he looked at the overlapping chains. That would require coordination at a level above departmental oversight. Ethan did not respond immediately, because the next segment of data had begun to resolve into a governance identity cluster, and when it fully appeared, it showed repeated activation markers tied to executive-level policy enforcement protocols that had been triggered multiple times across different operational cycles. Maya stepped forward slightly, her voice quiet but steady. So the breach was not a breach at all, Ethan answered after a short pause. It was execution of an existing governance rule set. Richard turned slowly toward the screen, his attention now fully locked on the origin cluster that had expanded into a complete structural map of decision authority. Samantha whispered almost to herself. Then the system was operating exactly as designed. Ethan confirmed. Yes, the behavior is consistent with design intent, not system failure. Daniel finally spoke again, slower than before. If this is design intent, then the question is no longer who bypassed security. Ethan continued the thought without looking away from the screen. The question becomes who defined the governance structure that allowed this outcome. And as the final layer of the governance log stabilized into a complete architectural overview of internal decision synchronization, the room collectively understood that they were no longer investigating an incident, but examining the framework that determined what the system was always permitted to conclude as truth. The complete governance architecture remained projected across the central display, but the room no longer reacted to it as information. Instead, it was processed as consequence. Ethan Blake stood with his hands still near the keyboard without typing, because the system was now generating results faster than any manual intervention could refine. Richard Holloway remained fixed on the origin layer of the governance structure, his expression controlled but increasingly distant, as if he was absorbing not just data but the implications of how deeply the structure extended into executive decision-making. Samantha Reed had shifted her focus entirely from procedure to interpretation, her voice breaking the silence only after a prolonged pause. If governance synchronization is real, then accountability is distributed across every layer that approved it. Ethan responded carefully. Correct, but distribution does not eliminate initiation points. Daniel Cross finally stepped closer to the display, his tone quieter than before. Then there must be a root initiator embedded somewhere in the executive approval chain. Ethan nodded once and expanded the final layer of system mapping, revealing a convergence node where all governance pathways intersected before branching outward into operational execution layers. The node pulsed faintly on the screen as if the system itself was acknowledging its own structure. Ethan spoke slowly. This is the convergence point for all synchronized approvals. Richard leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing as the system highlighted a single persistent identifier embedded within that convergence layer. Samantha followed the trace and exhaled softly. That identifier appears in every major approval sequence. Ethan confirmed. Yes, it is consistent across all governance cycles. Daniel's expression tightened as he studied the repeated signature. So the system is not randomizing authority, it is channeling it. Ethan responded. It is executing structured authorization routing under a unified governance directive. Maya Carter finally spoke again, her voice calm but precise. Which means every department believed they were making independent decisions, but they were all aligned to one controlled framework. Ethan turned slightly toward her for the first time, acknowledging the clarity of the statement. That is consistent with the data. Richard straightened fully now, his attention locked on the convergence node as it expanded further into historical records, showing that the same governance structure had influenced multiple prior internal decisions unrelated to the current incident. Samantha stepped closer to the screen, her tone now more analytical than emotional. If this structure has been active across multiple cycles, then it has been shaping outcomes long before today. Ethan confirmed quietly. Yes, the system logs indicate sustained operational influence. Daniel finally looked away from the screen for a moment, as if recalibrating his understanding of the entire investigation. Then the intern was never the source of the breach, he said slowly. Ethan answered without hesitation. The data does not support her as the origin point. A long silence followed, not of confusion but of recognition, because the architecture on the screen no longer represented an accusation or a defense, but a controlled decision environment that had shaped the outcome before the investigation had even begun. And as the convergence node stabilized into a complete governance model, every person in the room understood that the truth they were uncovering was not about who broke the system, but about how the system had been designed to define what breaking it even meant. The convergence node remained fixed on the central display, but its meaning inside the room had shifted again, no longer functioning as a technical diagram, but as a representation of systemic responsibility distributed across layers of authority. Ethan Blake stood motionless for a moment longer before continuing the analysis. Because the next extraction layer was not procedural data but behavioral governance patterns embedded across executive decision cycles, Richard Holloway did not move his gaze from the screen, but his voice broke the silence in a controlled tone. If this structure has been active across multiple cycles, then every major operational decision in this company may have been influenced. Ethan responded carefully. That is consistent with the continuity markers in the governance logs. Samantha Reed lowered her head slightly as she reviewed the historical timeline, now fully expanded across the screen, her voice quiet but steady. Then the question is not whether the system failed, but whether it was ever operating independently. Ethan paused briefly before answering. The system shows no evidence of independent decision isolation during the identified cycles. Daniel Cross finally spoke, his tone lower than before, which means every department trusted outputs that were already shaped upstream. Ethan confirmed, yes, downstream processes are fully dependent on upstream governance directives. Maya Carter, still standing near the glass wall, took a slow step forward, her voice calm but more direct than before. So when I was accused, the conclusion had already been shaped before any investigation began. Ethan turned slightly toward her, acknowledging the precision of the statement. The system indicates that classification and routing occurred prior to human review input. Richard's expression tightened slightly as he processed the implication, because it meant the investigation itself had been operating inside a predefined interpretation boundary. Samantha stepped closer to the screen again, focusing on a newly highlighted segment of the convergence structure, where multiple approval streams now appeared synchronized into a single directive origin cycle. This is not just influence, she said quietly. This is pre-structured decision alignment. Ethan nodded once. Yes. The system aligns interpretation thresholds with governance directives before evaluation occurs. Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes still on the layered approval chains. Then there was never a neutral starting point. Ethan responded after a brief pause. Correct. All evaluation layers inherit predefined governance context. A long silence followed as the meaning settled deeper into the room. Because neutrality itself had been removed from the decision architecture, Richard finally spoke again, his tone quieter but more controlled. Show me where the alignment directive originates. Ethan initiated the final trace through the convergence node, and as the system expanded once more, a centralized governance signature appeared at the top of the structure, connecting every approval chain, every routing layer, and every historical decision cycle into a unified origin framework. Samantha whispered without looking away from the screen. That means every conclusion we reach today was filtered through that structure. Ethan confirmed softly. Yes, every output reflects the constraints of that governance origin. Maya's voice followed after a brief pause, steady and measured. Then the truth was never hidden in the data, she said. It was shaped before the data was ever reviewed. And in that moment, the entire room understood that they were not uncovering a mistake in the system, but confronting the fact that the system had been quietly defining reality long before anyone realized they were no longer outside of it. The final governance origin framework remained displayed across the central screen, but its presence no longer functioned as a technical visualization. Instead, it behaved like a complete reconstruction of decision-making across the organization. Ethan Blake stood still as the system completed the last synchronization pass, confirming that every approval layer, every departmental validation, and every historical decision cycle had been aligned under a single governance origin structure. Richard Holloway remained facing the display, his posture rigid but controlled, as if any sudden reaction would disrupt the fragile comprehension forming in real time. Samantha Reed had shifted fully into analytical silence, her eyes moving across the expanded architecture of interconnected approvals that now showed no separation between departments. Daniel Cross stood slightly behind the main viewing line, his expression carefully neutral, but his attention fixed on the final branching node that tied all system behavior back into a unified directive source. Maya Carter remained near the glass wall, no longer isolated by scrutiny, but positioned as an observer of a system that had redefined the meaning of accusation itself. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice steady but lower than before. The governance origin structure is now fully resolved, he said, then continued after a brief pause. All decision pathways converge into a single directive control framework. Richard turned slightly toward him without looking away from the screen. Does that framework identify an accountable initiator? Ethan hesitated for a moment as the final layer completed its decryption, then responded carefully. The system does not assign responsibility in procedural terms. Samantha immediately responded, her tone quiet but firm. Then it is not designed for accountability, it is designed for alignment. Ethan nodded once. That is consistent with the architecture. Daniel's voice followed, lower and more controlled than before. Alignment still requires a source of configuration. Ethan acknowledged the point and expanded the final metadata layer, revealing a persistent governance signature embedded at the highest structural level of the system, repeated across multiple decision cycles and administrative cycles. Richard stepped slightly closer to the display, his attention narrowing as the identifier stabilized into a fixed governance identity marker that connected every approval sequence in the system. Samantha exhaled slowly. That signature appears in every major operational outcome. Ethan confirmed. Yes, it is the consistent origin marker across all synchronized decision chains. Maya finally spoke again, her voice calm but precise. So, every conclusion the company reached was shaped through that same structure. Ethan turned slightly toward her. Correct. All outcomes are filtered through the governance origin layer before execution. A long silence followed as the implications settled fully into the room, because what they were seeing was no longer an isolated breach investigation, but a complete mapping of how authority had been applied across the organization without visible disruption. Daniel Cross finally asked in a measured tone, if this structure has been active across all cycles, why was it never questioned? Ethan replied after a brief pause, because the system validates itself through its own governance loop. Richard remained still, studying the convergence of all pathways into the single origin marker, and after a moment he spoke quietly. Then the system did not misinterpret reality, he said. It defined it. And as the final synchronization completed and the screen stabilized into a unified governance model, every person in the room understood that they were no longer looking at a failure in process, but at a structure that had been quietly shaping every truth they believed they had independently discovered. The unified governance model remained stable on the central display, but the atmosphere inside the executive floor had changed completely, as if the system's final state had removed the possibility of debate and replaced it with full structural understanding. Ethan Blake stood at the console, without initiating any further queries because there were no remaining layers left to interpret. Richard Holloway remained facing the screen in silence for several seconds, his expression controlled but no longer anchored in certainty. Samantha Reed slowly lowered her gaze from the display, as if accepting that every procedural assumption she had relied on had been reconstructed in front of her. Daniel Cross stood still near the edge of the table, his posture unchanged but his focus no longer defensive. Maya Carter remained by the glass wall, no longer positioned as a subject of investigation, but as someone observing the final alignment of truth and system architecture. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm but deliberate. The governance origin framework is now fully resolved across all historical and active cycles, he said, then continued after a brief pause. There are no additional hidden layers in the current system structure. Richard did not respond immediately, his eyes still fixed on the convergence node where all approval pathways had merged into a single governing signature. Samantha finally broke the silence, her voice quiet and steady. Then every decision we reviewed today was never independent. Ethan answered carefully. Correct. All decisions were influenced by the same origin framework. Daniel exhaled slowly, his tone measured, which means the investigation itself was operating inside the same structure. Ethan confirmed. Yes, the evaluation process was also subject to governance alignment. A long silence followed as the implication fully settled. Because the system had not only defined outcomes, it had defined the conditions under which outcomes could be understood. Richard slowly turned away from the screen for the first time, looking across the room rather than at the data, and when he spoke, His voice was lower but no longer analytical. Show me the governance origin signature in plain terms. Ethan adjusted the display and simplified the final layer, revealing a single persistent authorization marker that had influenced every operational cycle, every approval pathway, and every internal validation sequence. Samantha stepped closer, studying it quietly, then said, "So this is not a breach case." Ethan replied, "No, it is a structural governance alignment system." Daniel looked at the screen for a moment longer before speaking. "Then accountability does not sit with one person." Ethan nodded once. "It exists at the level of system design." Richard remained silent for a long moment, then turned slightly toward Maya for the first time since the beginning of the session, and his voice carried a tone that no longer belonged to authority, but to realization. "Your evaluation was incorrect," he said quietly. Maya did not respond immediately, and when she did, her voice remained calm. "It was never about evaluation." Samantha closed her tablet completely and added softly, "It was about assumption." Ethan stepped back from the console as the system stabilized into a final static governance model, and for the first time since the beginning of the session, there was nothing left to analyze, only understanding. Richard took a slow breath and said, "Reverse all internal status actions taken against her." And there was no objection, no hesitation, only confirmation across the system. Maya stood still for a moment longer, then slowly turned toward the exit, not in triumph, not in anger, but in quiet resolution. And as she left the executive floor, the system behind her remained unchanged, but the people inside